Chapter 6, the Constitution and the New Republic. In this chapter, we are talking about the creation of the American government as we know it today. We've gone through the Revolution. We've successfully fought the Revolutionary War. We've created our first national government, the Articles of Confederation. And as we spoke about last chapter, it was proving to be a failure. Nothing was getting done. It becomes obvious that change is needed, and that change will take the form of our current Constitution. So that's what we're looking at in this chapter. So the broad themes, we are going to talk about the constitutional crisis. We're going to talk about the creation of the Constitution and the ratification of the Constitution. Just because the Constitution is written, unless the states agree to adopt it, it won't go into effect. And we will see that that is a very controversial question. A lot of people don't like the idea of this new Constitution. We'll talk about the beginning of American political parties with the era of the Federalists, and then we'll wrap up with what's known as the Revolution of 1800. But first, let's talk about the Constitutional Convention. As we mentioned last chapter, it becomes obvious that the Articles of Confederation are not working out. By the mid-1780s, the national government was a bit of a joke. Remember that the only national authority is the Congress of the Confederation, and it has a lot of problems. They don't have a permanent meeting place. Some years they meet in Philadelphia, some years they meet in New York. It switches back and forth amongst all these cities. And by the end, it gets to the point where people aren't even showing up. It has become so ineffective that the members of Congress simply stop showing up. And if you don't have enough members, if you don't have what's known as a quorum, you have to have a certain number of members present in order to get anything done. And they didn't have that minimum number. So it's a bit of a joke. And it becomes obvious that many different groups in the United States want a more powerful national authority. They want somebody in charge who can tell other people what to do. One of these leading reformers is a man by the name of Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton really is a sort of rags to riches story, success story in the United States. He's a illegitimate son, born of a Scottish immigrant, grew up in the Caribbean, later moved to the United States. He served as one of George Washington's aides during the Revolutionary War. That's sort of how he got his big break. And as we will see in just a minute, or right now actually, Hamilton was one of the leading voices calling for an overhaul of the Articles of Confederation, along with men like James Madison. These sort of men want a stronger national government. And so they start off by calling what's known as the Annapolis Convention. This is the first meeting that's really held to discuss changing the Articles because they're simply not working. Well, as you can see, at the Annapolis Convention, only 6 states show up. And this is a pretty big blow. Remember that in order to pass any new legislation, you have to have 9 out of the 13 states. And if you want to change the articles themselves, you have to have the full 13 on board. So the fact that less than half of the states show up at the initial meeting, that does not bode well for Madison and Hamilton and their supporters in creating this stronger national government. And they realize they need someone to give them an air of legitimacy. They need someone attending these conventions that when other people hear so-and-so is there, they realize that this is for real. And they find that person in George Washington. George Washington agrees to attend the next convention at Philadelphia in 1787, which will hereafter be known as the Constitutional Convention. And this one is much more successful than the Annapolis Convention. By 1787, 12 out of the 13 states were willing to talk. I do want you to know that the men that attended the Constitutional Convention is not representative of American society. The men that attended, by and large, are wealthy, educated men who are the political and powerful elite of American society. I also want to point out that there are a number of founding fathers that don't attend the Constitutional Convention. Men like Patrick Henry, who famously said that he smelt a rat. Men like Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence. They do not attend the Constitutional Convention. They understood the Articles had problems, but they wanted to keep the Articles rather than overhaul them. So I want you to understand that just calling the Constitutional Convention itself was a bit of a controversy. Now, the delegates to the convention could agree on a few things. Number one, pretty much everyone agreed that the structure of government should feature separate, distinct parts. That each branch should be separate and distinct from the other branches. And pretty much everyone agreed that one of the biggest loopholes of the Articles of Confederation was the fact that Congress could not tax. So they were going to remedy that. So pretty much everyone could agree that the government should consist of separate branches, and everyone agreed that Congress should be able to raise money. However, beyond that, it turns out that a lot of the delegates are not on the same page. And what we see happen is that two competing plans are going to emerge. On the one hand, you have the Virginia plan, which is sponsored by James Madison. He was from Virginia. Virginia had the largest delegation there. They have the most people. They have the most powerful voice. The Virginia plan is the most popular plan, and it favors the larger states. It featured a two-house legislature. It would be based on population. The more people that a state had, the more votes it got. Remember that under the Articles of Confederation, it was one state, one vote. So, for instance, the state of Rhode Island had just as much power as the state of Virginia, even though the state of Virginia was quite a bit larger than the state of Rhode Island. Under the Virginia plan, it would be based on population. More people, more votes. The lower house would be chosen by popular vote. The upper house would be chosen by the lower house. Well, a lot of states, including states like Rhode Island and Delaware and New Jersey, don't like the Virginia plan because it obviously favored the larger states because it would give them more power. And so the competing plan that emerged is known as the New Jersey plan, which kept a unicameral house. It kept the one state, one vote, but they did give in on the separate branches of government. They did agree to create a federal judiciary. And another thing which was interesting, the early revisions of the New Jersey plan called for a plural executive. Instead of having one president of the United States, they called for a presidential council of multiple people. So I've always thought that's kind of an interesting little side note. Well, the debate goes on and on and on and on. The smaller states are not willing to give up their political power. They're not willing to budge on this idea of one state, one vote. And the larger states know that if they can't get at least a few of the smaller states on board, these plans would have no hope in getting through. So they have to come up with a solution. They have to come up with some sort of compromise. And finally, after weeks of debate, Roger Sherman does come up with a compromise that will forever be known as the Great Compromise. And this essentially is the form of government that we have today. There will be a two-house legislature. The lower house will be based on population. The upper house would feature a fixed 2 per state, of course, today. The lower house is known as the House of Representatives. The upper is known as the Senate. And there are 3 branches of government: the legislative branch, headed up by Congress, the executive branch, headed up by the President, and the judicial branch, headed up by the Supreme Court. So, as you can see, that is the form of government that we live in today. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about this Constitution. One major feature of this new Constitution is the limits to democracy. And we've spoken about this before. The Founding Fathers really have to sort of complete a balancing act, right? Because on the one hand, they understand that there is the need for coordination amongst the states. but on the other hand, they don't want to empower too strong of a central government. Well, under the Articles of Confederation, the power was very widely dispersed. There was not a strong national government, and we saw that sort of blew up in everyone's faces. So under the Constitution, they go the opposite direction, and they decide to put more limits on popular democracy. As Alexander Hamilton said, the masses seldom judge or determine right. And you can see this in the way that the leadership of the national government is chosen. Under the Constitution, people did not vote on the president. Even today, we don't vote on the president. Technically, the president is elected by the body known as the Electoral College. Now, most times, the person that gets the most votes gets the person that gets the most popular votes usually wins the Electoral College. But that's not necessarily always the case. More people can vote for you, and you can still lose the election for president. It happened in 2000 with Al Gore and George W. Bush. Al Gore received more votes than George W. Bush, but because George W. Bush won the Electoral College, he became president. Under the original Constitution, people did not elect their senators. Now, we do today, but that's only because the 17th Amendment was passed back in the 1920s or 30s. In the original Constitution, your senators were chosen by the state legislature. Now, of course, people voted on the state legislature, so you would assume that you would vote on people who would choose the senators you would agree with, but that may not necessarily have been the case. And federal judges. People today do not vote on any federal judge. They are chosen by the president and they are ratified by the Senate. Now, again, you would hope that your senator would vote the way you want to, but most people have absolutely nothing to do with the choosing of federal judges, and that's from the lowest level of the federal court system all the way up to the Supreme Court. So you can see they definitely placed some limits on the idea of democracy in the original Constitution. Now, the man that is generally credited with authoring the Constitution is James Madison. He is regarded as the father of the Constitution. He came up with the bulk of the ideas, or at least he's the one that put a lot of these ideas down on paper. And two of the big questions that he has to answer in drafting the Constitution, the question of sovereignty and the question of limiting power. The question of sovereignty is a pretty big one. Do the states have the power, or does the federal government? And remember, under the Articles of Confederation, there was no debate at all. The states had the power. The states were independent, sovereign entities that could essentially do what they wanted to, and the national government could not control them. And that was really one of the big failings with the Articles of Confederation, is that there wasn't a strong central government. So now under this new Constitution, people are wondering, are we going to keep that same system? How do we divide the power? If you've got a strong, powerful national government, but you want to keep strong, powerful state governments, how do you resolve that question as who has the power? Well, he sort of dodges the question. He says, well, it doesn't matter. The power doesn't come from the states or the federal government. It comes from the people. This idea of popular sovereignty, the idea that the people have the power. Plus, as he points out, the powers of the government are going to be distributed between the three branches of government. The legislative branch creates the laws, the executive branch enforces the laws, and the judicial branch interprets the laws. That's the idea, that the states won't get too powerful and the federal government won't get too powerful because no one branch has all the power. The powers are distributed between the states and between the three branches of the national government. Now, there's also this question of limiting power. The Baron de Montesquieu, who is one of these Enlightenment philosophers that a lot of the American political philosophical ideas come from, he says, you know what? Large republics just won't work. And I think what he was talking about was in terms of geographic size. Because think about the United States today. Think about a country, even if you limit it to the original 13 states, New York was a long way away from, say, Charleston, South Carolina. And remember, this is in the days before telephones or emails or radio or TV or whatever. And Montesquieu was making the argument, kind of out of sight, out of mind, that if the politicians live and do their work in New York or Philadelphia, they're not thinking about the citizens of South Carolina. They're not seeing them on a daily basis. They just become, numbers on a piece of paper. They're not actual people. And think about the United States today. If you've got someone in, say, California, and somebody in Washington, D.C. doesn't interact with that person on a daily basis, what the Founding Fathers or what Montesquieu was afraid of was that it's going to be much easier for someone to take advantage of someone that lives a long way away. So if you're a politician working in New England, it'll be easier to treat people living in South Carolina more harshly because you don't see and interact with them on a day-to-day basis. So there's a very real question as to whether or not a large republic could function. Turns out it can, and one of the reasons why it can is because the larger the republic gets, the more groups there are that are competing for power. And so that inherently says that no one group, it's going to be very difficult for any one group to dominate the government because there's all these different groups that are competing for power. Plus, as Madison points out, you have the separation of powers, you have the system of checks and balances. For example, Congress can pass a law, but if the president doesn't like it, he can veto it. Congress can go back and override that veto. The Supreme Court can declare the law unconstitutional. No one branch is going to be able to dominate the other branches. So for all these reasons, the argument is made that this new Constitution is going to work out. Now, there are still some questions. There are some weak spots in the new Constitution. For example, questions raised over trade and slavery, and both of these are mainly concerns of the South. One major issue for the South are exports. Pretty much everything at this point, tobacco and to a lesser extent cotton and indigo and rice, these crops, they are grown in the South and sold overseas. And the South does not want to have to deal with export taxes. They don't want to have to pay more to sell their goods overseas. So there is a ban in the Constitution on export taxes. We are one of the few countries in the world left that do not tax their imports. A bigger question is going to be slavery. Number one, are there going to be protections for the institution of slavery in the Constitution? And number two, when we start talking about the House of Representatives, how will slaves count towards the population? Obviously, the southern states wanted to count them in population because it would give them larger populations and thus more representation. But northern states did not. They made the argument that slaves are not citizens, so therefore they shouldn't be counted. And of course, as we all know, they came up with another compromise known as the 3/5 compromise, which said that 3 out of every 5 slaves would be counted towards population for the purposes of representation in the Houses of Representatives. Beyond that, the Constitution does not address the issue of slavery. And as we've already mentioned, as we move into the 1790s, into the early 1800s, it's not that slavery wasn't an issue. It was. It was already becoming an issue between the North and South. And the reality of it is that the solutions they came up with, number one, do not address the problems fully. And number two, they're temporary solutions. They're band-aids on this major gaping wound that will finally, as we all know, will fight a civil war over it. So the Founding Fathers had the opportunity. They could have put down in the Constitution, yes, we will have slavery. No, we will not have slavery. It would have been maybe not easy, but it would have been a simpler solution. But they do not address the question of slavery, and as a result, as we know, 50 to 60 years later, we're going to fight a civil war over it. A few other shortcomings in the original Constitution: there is no definition of citizenship. There is no list of individual rights. And the end result is a structure of government in which the states lose power and the national government gains power. The Constitution creates powerful new institutions. It reduces the power of the states and, by default, the powers of the people, and limits the idea of popular democracy. And the end result is that the national government becomes incredibly much stronger and the states become much weaker. Okay, so we have the Constitution. 55 men get together in Philadelphia, and over the course of several weeks, they hash out this new form of government. They come up with this new Constitution. But just because they come up with it, just because these 55 men sign off on it, doesn't mean that it's automatically the law of the land. They have to get everyone else to agree to this, right? And you have to understand that these men have vastly overstepped their authority. They went to Philadelphia to amend the Constitution to change, they went to Philadelphia to amend the Articles, to change and fix the Articles, but instead they have created a whole new government. So the question is, how did they get people to ratify it? Well, under the Articles, remember, in order to change the Articles, it had to be unanimous. Well, they know, the Constitutional Convention knows they will not get every state to sign off on it. First of all, Rhode Island did not even attend the Constitutional Convention. But luckily, since they have created a new government, they can create their own rules. They can't meet the rules, so they changed them. Instead of the full 13, they said as long as 9 states ratify, as long as 9 states agree to this new Constitution, it will become the law of the land. The Constitution will be ratified by special state conventions, not by state legislatures, because remember, essentially, these state legislatures will be voting themselves out of power, and they knew no one was going to do that. So specially called state conventions, all they do, their only job is to show up and vote yes or no. You can't make any changes. You can't say, I like this, but I want to change that. No, everybody shows up, and it's just straight up yes or no vote. Well, we see that debate is quickly going to break out across the United States. Those that were for the Constitution became known as the Federalists, and those that opposed the Constitution became known as the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists obviously supported ratification of the Constitution. The members that attended the Constitutional Convention, men like Alexander Hamilton, Ben Franklin, Madison, George Washington, those were counted in the ranks of the Federalists. And then you have the Anti-Federalists that argued that the Constitution was too powerful, that this new government would step on the rights of its citizens, and their main leader was Thomas Jefferson. In order to drum up support for this Constitution, the Federalists are going to write a series of essays, a series of essentially newspaper articles that, when taken together, are known as the Federalist Papers. And the Federalist Papers are the cornerstone of American political thought. If you want to know what the Constitution really means, read the Federalist Papers. It was written by the guys that wrote the Constitution to explain the Constitution to the common people. The Federalist Papers, written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. So, for example, and we're just going to run through these fairly quickly. The Federalist number 10 was Madison's argument that a large republic would work. Federalist number 51 outlined the system of checks and balances and how no one branch of government could dominate the other branch. Federalist number 84, Hamilton's argument that there is no list of rights. And this is actually an interesting one. One of the main criticisms of the Anti-Federalists is that there were very few rights guaranteed in the Constitution. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this. Number one, most state constitutions did have lists of rights, and the Federalists argued that those protections were sufficient. They didn't need the national government to guarantee these rights if the state governments did. And number two, Hamilton's argument says, look, whenever you put a number to something, if you say you have these 10 rights or these 15 rights or these 20 rights, just by placing a number on them, you are limiting them, because over time, people will no longer say, these are my 10 rights. People will begin to say, you only have these 10 rights. So that's why Hamilton argues that we don't actually need a list of national rights, is because it would be too limiting in the end. And then you have the Federalist number 78, which outlines the theory of judicial review, which we will talk in depth about a little bit later. And then on the other hand, you have the Federalists arguing for ratification. You have the anti-Federalists who say, no, the Constitution is too powerful. We fought a war to get away from a strong central government. Why are we trading a king in England for a king in the United States? We are the spirit of the revolution. The Federalists are moving away from what made the American Revolution great. They say this government is too powerful, too large. They want a Bill of Rights. They want a list they can point to and say, I have these 10 or 15 or 20 rights. So really what it boils down, each side is afraid. The Federalists are afraid of disorder and mob rule. Everyone saw what happened under the Articles of Confederation. Everyone can tell that as the Articles stood, they were not working. And the Federalists are afraid of that. They're afraid of anarchy. They're afraid of mob rule. They're afraid of disorder. On the other hand, you have the anti-Federalists who say that maybe the Articles weren't working, but we're moving too far in the other direction. We're afraid that if you concentrate power in the hands of one person or the hands of one government, it will take advantage of its citizens. So that is the debate. The Federalists are afraid of anarchy. The anti-Federalists are afraid of concentrated power. The Federalists drew support from cities and merchants. The anti-Federalists drew support from rural areas and small farmers. And finally again, after weeks of debate, they finally agree on what's known as the Massachusetts Compromise, in which the Federalists said, okay, if you agree to ratify the Constitution, the first thing we will do is give you your Bill of Rights. If you agree to put the Constitution into power, we promise the first thing this new government will do will grant you this list of rights. And so by June of 1788, 9 states had ratified it. And technically, once that 9th state signed on to it, it was the law of the land. The problem was that list of 9 states did not include New York or Virginia, the 2 most populated, most powerful states in the Union. Eventually they will sign on, and eventually it will even become unanimous. So even Rhode Island, who did not attend the Constitutional Convention, that was the last holdout, it's the smallest state, it had the most to lose, even it eventually signs off on the Constitution. And so they do get their Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights, that's the common name for the first 10 amendments, and the grants, the rights that are granted or protected under the Bill of Rights are pretty well known. Right to freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, right to a fair and speedy trial, the right from unreasonable searches and seizures. Those things are all included in the Bill of Rights. Basically, it is a list of natural rights, from John Locke's argument. The first 9 place limitations on Congress. Congress cannot take away your freedom of religion. Congress cannot take away your freedom of speech or the right to assemble. Congress cannot force you to bear witness against yourself. And then the 10th is actually an interesting one. The 10th is the source of the Reserved Powers Clause, which says essentially that if the Constitution does not specifically grant a power to the federal government, that power is reserved, or that power belongs to the states. And as we will see a little bit later on, the Constitution is a fairly short and vague document. There aren't a lot of powers specifically given out to the legislative, judicial, and executive branches. So you would think that even with a stronger national government, the bulk of the powers would be reserved for the states. And of course, if you look at the federal government today, who's more powerful, the federal government or the state governments? Well, it's the federal government by far, right? So that's actually an interesting amendment that they threw in there. National identity. If the government is based on the will of the citizens, the big question is, who are we? And remember, this is one of the things that the Constitution does not address. At this time, I think you can really make the argument for ethnic nationalism, that the American government operated on the idea that in order to be American, you have to be a certain race. And of course, at this time, as you know, really the only people with political power were rich white dudes, right? You have to be male, you have to be white, and you have to own property. Now, eventually, I think people are going to sort of switch over to the idea of civic nationalism, where the idea that American is not a certain race, it's what you believe. It's that you believe in popular sovereignty, and you believe in self-government, and you believe in democracy and republicanism and all these other great things. But anyway, I just want to throw that in there. Let's talk about the Federalists. The Federalist era, because after the creation of the Constitution, the Federalists will be in power for the first 12 years of the new government. And of course, as we all know, maybe not the first president in American history, but the first president under the Constitution is, of course, George Washington. He is the unanimous choice as president. The only time in American history that the choice for president has been unanimous was with George Washington, and then eventually George Washington's re-election. It's interesting. Under the original Constitution, there are no term limits for president. In fact, Alexander Hamilton was very much in favor of electing a president for life. Just think about what life would be like then. But they agreed that a president should serve a 4-year term with no limit on how many times he could be reelected. George Washington was elected twice. He served his 8 years, and then he stepped down. And he sort of set the precedent that as a president should serve 2 terms and then step down. And it was that way for years and years and years. And it wasn't until the 1940s and Franklin Roosevelt, 30s and 40s, that Franklin Roosevelt was elected to 4 terms as president. And then later, the Constitution was amended, so now you can only serve 2 terms. But George Washington sort of set that up for everybody else. So, okay, we've got George Washington as the first president. But things, however, are not peaceful because this debate over ratification sort of spills over to the new government. Even though the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists sort of agreed on the Bill of Rights compromise, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to start getting along with one another. And as I mentioned, the first 12 years are going to belong to the Federalists. And what that really means is they belong to Alexander Hamilton. Because even though George Washington is president, and George Washington himself did not claim to be a Federalist. He was. But he claimed to be of no particular political party. The power behind George Washington and the source of a lot of his ideas will be Alexander Hamilton. And as I mentioned, Alexander Hamilton has a world vision of the United States. He wants the American government to become powerful. He wants the United States to become a global power. And in order to transform the United States into a global power, Hamilton has a 5-part plan. Alexander Hamilton's 5-part plan for power. First step, he wanted to fund the debt. And what that means is Hamilton wants the federal government to assume the debts. Alexander Hamilton wants the national government to assume the debts created in the Revolutionary War. And what that means is a lot of this debt is held by individual people. And that would make the federal government responsible for repaying this debt. And of course, you're asking yourself, why would anyone want to pay debt willingly? Why would they willingly take on someone else's debt? The reason for that is that if the wealthy people are being repaid by the federal government, they have a stake in the outcome of that government, and they're going to fight harder to make sure that government succeeds. If you know that the only way you're getting your money back is if the federal government sticks around, you're going to do whatever you can to make sure that it does so. So that's the reason he wants the national government to take over the debt created by the states, is so it ties the wealthy people to the federal government. In that same idea, he wants to create new debt. The more money the government owes, the more people have a stake in making sure that it succeeds. He would be ecstatic about today's government, right? Or maybe not. He wants to create a national bank. At this point in time, the United States is really young. We don't have a strong financial institution. We don't have very many banks. So he wants to create a national bank as a place where the federal government can collect taxes, the federal government can keep its money and know that it's safe. He wants to create a national bank, and he's going to help pay for all this by new taxes. Taxes on liquor and taxes on goods coming into the United States, on imported goods known as tariffs. So Alexander Hamilton's 5-part plan for power. He is going to meet immediate opposition from Thomas Jefferson and his old ally, James Madison. Thomas Jefferson has a very different wish for the United States. Alexander Hamilton wanted a strong, powerful United States. He wanted the United States to be a global player in military, politics, economic matters. He wanted the United States to become a superpower. Thomas Jefferson doesn't care about any of that. He thought the best way for the United States to go was for everybody to be a farmer. Wide distribution of land, everybody on pretty much equal footing. That is the vision that Jefferson has for the United States. And if you notice, those two taxes, the taxes on liquor and the taxes on imports, they are actually going to hit the farmers the hardest. So they kind of see Alexander Hamilton as directly attacking their support base. Well, in the end, Hamilton is successful. He gets his plan passed, and it does exactly what he wants it to. He is able to restore faith in the American government. So he is successful in getting his plan passed, and it does exactly what he thinks it will do. It restores the faith in the United States government. And again, not everyone is thrilled. Jefferson doesn't care anything about Europe. In order for Hamilton's plan to fully take form, it's going to require very deep ties between America and Europe to get this trade off the ground. We're going to have to do a lot of business with the Europeans. Jefferson doesn't want that. He would rather for the United States to expand westward rather than getting closer into bed with Europe. And as I mentioned, he wants a nation of small farmers. And these small farmers are the exact ones that's being targeted by Hamilton and his new taxes. Divisions will get even deeper over the French Revolution. The French Revolution starts slightly, just shortly after the American Revolution. Remember that France is our main source of aid, and so we have a lot of influence on the French Revolution. We give them a lot of ideas. But unlike the American Revolution, as you can see here in this painting, this is the storming of the Bastille, the French Revolution quickly turns incredibly bloody. Now, we have our own share of death with the Revolutionary War, but tens of thousands of people died during the French Revolution, and of course, as you probably know, they even killed their king. So men like Hamilton were looking at the French Revolution as little better than anarchy. It is anarchy. It's chaos. People are out of control. While people like Thomas Jefferson would be more inclined to support the French Revolution. Now here's the deal. The Founding Fathers were against the idea of political parties. In fact, if you read the Constitution, you will not see anything mentioned about political parties in the Constitution. The Founding Fathers made a conscious effort to avoid them. The argument was that political parties would become too divisive, that political parties over time would only seek to further their own interests and not represent the will of the people. And so they truly tried to stay away. Like I mentioned, George Washington was not a member of a political party. He claimed that he was completely independent. All that being said, by the time that the Federalists are in power, Thomas Jefferson's getting kind of desperate. And he sees Alexander Hamilton winning, and he sees Alexander Hamilton implementing his plan for government. And so Jefferson thinks the only way I can counter this, the only way I can oppose the Federalists is if I create a political party and I organize the opposition to the Federalists, and that is exactly what he's going to do. And so that brings us into the first party era, and the first two political parties in the United States will become the Republicans and the Federalists. It's not the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. It will be Thomas Jefferson's Republicans, who many of them were the anti-Federalists, but it will be the Republicans as led by Jefferson and the Federalists as led by Hamilton. Now, don't make the mistake. These are not today's Republicans. As a matter of fact, the Republicans of Jefferson are actually today's Democrats. Yeah, I know. We'll talk about how that happens a little bit later. So the mid-1790s, America has evolved into a political party system. On one hand, you have the Republicans. On the other hand, you have the Federalists. So what do they stand for? The Federalists want closer ties to Great Britain. They are supported by wealthy, established political leaders. They believe that society is a hierarchy. Society is a ladder. You've got some at the top, some in the middle, some in the bottom. And on the other hand, you've got the Republicans. They're more sympathetic to the French. They're supported by southern planters and small farmers, and they're much more critical of social inequality. Now, as we mentioned, the Federalists are going to be in power for the first 12 years, and they're going to remain in power by solving two main problems. Number one, the problems about the western lands, most notably the Whiskey Rebellion. Some of these small farmers that are upset about paying the new taxes on liquor rise up in rebellion. And as you see here in this picture, George Washington personally led an army to put down this rebellion. Now, no actual fighting happens. Once the army leaves Washington marching on, I believe it was Philadelphia, the rebellion quickly dies down. But can you imagine if, say, for instance, George W. Bush or President Obama had personally led the American army into a fighting situation? That would have been crazy. So that's one thing. They do manage to hold on to the western lands and impose law and order on the western lands. And number two, they do manage to secure America's international position. America's got a problem because nobody's really taking them seriously, especially the British. Even though the Peace of Paris of 1783, one of the terms was that Great Britain would recognize the United States was an independent country, they're kind of being sore losers, and they're not really giving us the respect that we deserve. And so that is one major issue that the Federalists are going to have to tackle. Now, the French and the English actually go to war during the French Revolution. And so the Federalists are trying their very hardest to maintain neutrality. Nobody wants to get sucked into another global war. We're a young, weak, poor nation. We don't want to fight another war. We're trying to remain neutral. Well, both the French and the British try to infringe on that neutrality. You have the Citizen Genet scandal, where a French diplomat comes to the United States and tries to hire a bunch of American sailors and ships to go fight for the French, even though that was not allowed. You have what's known as the impressments of the British. What they would do, they would stop American ships at sea and look for runaway British sailors. And if they found runaway British sailors, they would take them back to England. Well, sometimes they didn't look that hard, and some Americans ended up being taken as well. So both sides really cause America a lot of grief, but since the Federalists are in control, they're much more worried about keeping the peace with Britain than they are with keeping the peace with France. So Hamilton sends John Jay to negotiate a new treaty with Great Britain, known as Jay's Treaty. We'll talk about it a little bit later. He also sends Thomas Pinckney to sign a new treaty with Spain. Okay. 1796, George Washington is going to retire. And in his farewell address, this is another tradition set up by George Washington. It is the tradition of every outgoing American president to give a farewell address, sort of one last speech to the nation. And in Washington's farewell address, he warns against, number one, political parties, which had already taken root in America, and number two, what he called foreign entanglements, the idea that America needs to stay out of these foreign matters, especially foreign military matters. So George Washington was the unanimous first choice. Everybody loved him. He was the father of his country, but now he's stepping down. He's gone. He'll die shortly thereafter as he gets into retirement. So now the office of president is wide open, and there's going to be fierce competition And of course, as the leaders of the two political parties, well, I guess he's not really a leader. John Adams will run for the Federalist Party. Hamilton's the leader, but nobody's going to vote for Hamilton. He's already made too many enemies over the years. So the next guy up is John Adams, who had served as Washington's Secretary of State. And he's going to run against Thomas Jefferson for years and years and years and years. In order to become president, the traditional stepping stone was not the vice president. I know it kind of seems like in today's modern world, if you want to be president, you need to serve as vice president first, and then you can run for president. You know, Ronald Reagan's vice president, George Bush became president. Bill Clinton, his vice president, Al Gore, ran for and nearly became president. There have been quite a bit of talk about our current vice president, Joe Biden, running for president. So, kind of today, the traditional job you hold before president, not uncommonly, is vice president. But back then, the much more usual route you would take is you would serve as Secretary of State, then you would run for president. But okay, fine. John Adams, the Secretary of State, runs against Thomas Jefferson. Now, because of the way the Constitution is originally set up, remember, they weren't thinking about political parties when they wrote the Constitution. So under the original Constitution, the way it worked was the person with the most votes, I guess the man with the most votes, became president, while the person with the second number of votes became vice president. Now, this led to a situation where John Adams gets the most votes narrowly. He wins and becomes president. But Thomas Jefferson gets the second number of votes, and he becomes vice president. So we have a Federalist president and a Republican vice president. Think about that. What would happen today if we had a Republican president and a Democratic vice president? Nothing would get done. Now, Adams as president was not that great. He was an incredibly intelligent individual. He was a fantastic diplomat, but he could be a cold person. He was distant. He wasn't very charismatic. He was really hard to connect with. And so even though he was an incredibly intelligent man, he let you know that. He could be pretty condescending at times. So he was not the leader. He did not inspire men the way that George Washington did. And the Federalists are going to be faced with a pretty big question. And this is actually a question that the United States has to answer on a regular basis. Do we want more stability or do we want more liberty? The more laws and the more control over its citizens the federal government has, the more stable life is. But you don't have a whole lot of freedoms. If you want more liberty, you have more freedoms, but there's more of a chance that something could go wrong. It's just like after 9/11. 9/11, the United States has a choice between stability and liberty. Well, look at all the laws that were passed after 9/11 to protect the American population. You've got the Patriot Act with a wiretapping. You've got, increased travel regulations and all those sorts of things. And that's fine. We haven't had a major terrorist attack since. But on the other hand, it's also made life more restrictive. And that's a question that America is always going to have to grapple with. More stability or more liberty. Okay, well, this war between Great Britain and France, even though we claim to be neutral, we do eventually get caught up in it. The tipping point is what's known as the XYZ affair. We send diplomats over to France to conduct negotiations with them. And before they even get off the boat, the French officials say, well, if you want to do business with our government, you have to pay us money. That deeply offends the American diplomats. They get back on their ships, sail straight back to America. And it led to what's known as the quasi-war. We don't declare war against France. It's sort of an undeclared war on the high seas. Anytime an American ship and a French ship meet, they shoot at each other. They exchange gunfire. So it's not a declared war. It's sort of this undeclared war between America and France. So the Federalists are running high. They've got popular support. The people are behind them. They are enjoying quite a bit of a surge in popularity. And they're going to use this power to pass what are known as the Alien and Sedition Acts, which, number one, it makes it harder for foreigners to become citizens. That's the Alien Act. But the Sedition Act is a little bit different, and it goes deeper. Sedition is actions taken against your country. And essentially what the Sedition Act did, it allowed for persecution of those engaged in quote-unquote sedition. Basically, anyone critical of the government. And they used this primarily against the Republicans. All of a sudden, it was a crime to criticize the government. And of course, that's what the Republicans were doing. They were criticizing the Federalist-led government. And so what ended up happening is that a number of Republican newspaper editors are going to be thrown in jail. It's all legal, but it doesn't, it's not really what America stands for, right? And so the Republicans are going to fight back with what are known as the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. The Virginia resolution says essentially that we must protect free speech. That is one of the common rights guaranteed in the First Amendment. That's a natural right as guaranteed by John Locke's argument. We must protect free speech. The Kentucky resolution is a little bit different. It goes deeper. It says, you know what? The federal government doesn't have the right to do this to their citizens. The federal government, all it is an agreement. It's a compact between the states. The states created the federal government, which in a sense they did, right? The states existed before the federal government. So in some ways, the federal government is a creation of the states. But this argument says that since the federal government was created between the states, that means the states inherently are more powerful, and that states can nullify federal laws. Essentially, if states don't agree with the laws that are passed, such as the Alien and Sedition Acts, if states don't agree with the laws that are passed by the federal government, they can nullify or ignore those federal laws. Well, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, they are not widespread. They don't have a whole lot of support. It's not like everyone is all of a sudden talking about these. But this is very important because especially what the Kentucky resolution, what that is talking about is the issue of states' rights. Who has more power, the state governments or the federal government? And that sort of thinking, the idea that states can nullify federal laws, even though the Constitution explicitly says there's what's known as the Supremacy Clause. Even though the Constitution explicitly says the federal government is supreme to the states, they're raising this question over the distribution of powers. And that is the same thing that is eventually going to lead, one of the things that will lead into the American Civil War. And so here we are, the election of 1800. The country is bitterly divided. You have the Federalists on one side and the Republicans on the other, and nobody is happy. Now, what is going to happen is that the revolution of 1800 is going to be a shift in the way the American government operates. Because we will see a new political party. The Republicans will be voted into power in the election of 1800, and they say they're going to get back to the ideals of the American Revolution. They say this new Constitution has drifted too far. It's moved too far away from what the Founding Fathers originally wanted with the American Revolution, and so they are going to make a return to the spirit of the American Revolution, and this is going to be a new revolution of its own. In fact, they call it the Revolution of 1800, and that is